On a chilly Monday morning, the air buzzed with energy inside the grand marble halls of First National Reserve Bank. The line at the teller counters snaked through the lobby, filled with people chatting about their day or scrolling on their phones. Amidst the usual crowd stood an elderly woman who seemed out of place. Her name was Edith Bellamy, though no one knew it yet. Dressed in a faded floral dress and worn-out shoes, she clutched a tattered burlap sack tightly to her chest, as if guarding something precious. Edith moved slowly but purposefully toward the front desk. Her presence drew curious glances from those around her. Some whispered behind cupped hands, wondering why someone like her, so plainly dressed, so unassuming, was there. When she finally reached the counter, a young teller named Lisa greeted her with a polite smile. "How may I assist you today?" Lisa asked, her tone professional yet distant. Without hesitation, Edith leaned forward slightly and said in a clear, steady voice, "I own this bank." For a moment, there was silence. Then came the laughter. It started with a chuckle from Lisa, quickly spreading to nearby customers and employees. A man holding a briefcase snickered into his hand, while a woman in a sharp suit shook her head dismissively. Even the security guard cracked a grin. To them, Edith's claim sounded absurd. A poor, elderly black woman owning one of the largest banks in the city. Impossible. But Edith didn't flinch. She stood tall, her deep brown eyes scanning the room. Her calm demeanor only made the laughter grow louder. One man even joked, "Ma'am, did you bring your checkbook too?" More giggles followed. Yet beneath the surface, something unsettling began to stir. There was a quiet strength in Edith's posture, a certainty that didn't match the ridicule she faced. Lisa, now feeling awkward, tried to soften the situation. Ma'am," she said gently, "this is a very serious matter. Do you have any proof of what you're saying?" Edith simply nodded and lifted the sack slightly, its coarse fabric brushing against the polished countertop. "Everything I need is right here," she replied, her voice unwavering. This statement prompted more skeptical looks. What could possibly be inside that old sack? Clothes? Junk? Surely nothing worth taking seriously. Despite the mockery, Edith refused to leave. She waited patiently until the manager, Marcus Lane, arrived to address the growing spectacle. He ushered her away from the prying eyes of the lobby and into his office, still convinced this would end quickly. After all, how could anyone believe such an outlandish story? Yet, as Edith sat across from him, her piercing gaze locked onto his, Marcus couldn't shake off a nagging feeling. Was she truly delusional, or was there more to her words than met the eye? Little did he know, this encounter would set off a chain of events that would change the bank, and everyone involved. Forever. Inside Marcus Lane's office, the atmosphere was tense yet strangely charged. The sleek furniture and framed certificates on the walls screamed professionalism, but Edith Bellamy seemed unfazed by her surroundings. She sat upright in the chair, her hands resting lightly on the burlap sack she had placed on her lap. Her calmness contrasted sharply with Marcus's growing unease. He leaned back in his leather chair, trying to maintain an air of authority while sizing her up. "Ms. Bellamy," Marcus began, choosing his words carefully, "you understand that claiming ownership of a bank is, well, quite extraordinary. Can you explain why you believe this?" Edith nodded slowly, as if expecting the question. She took a deep breath before speaking, her voice steady and measured. "This bank wasn't always what it is today," she said. "Years ago, during segregation, my family ran a small savings institution for black families. People trusted us because no one else would help them. We weren't rich, but we were honest." Marcus frowned, intrigued despite himself. "And then what happened?" he asked, genuinely curious now. Edith's expression darkened slightly. "Bigger banks wanted our customers and our business. They pressured us, made deals behind closed doors. Eventually, they forced us out, but not everything was done legally. My grandfather owned shares in the original company, and those shares were never transferred properly. That makes me a rightful owner." Her words hung in the air, heavy with history and implication. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He'd heard vague stories about how some banks expanded during that era, but he'd never given much thought to the human cost. Still, skepticism lingered. "Do you have any proof of this?" he asked cautiously. Without hesitation, Edith reached into the sack and pulled out a bundle of yellowed papers tied together with fraying string. She laid them gently on the desk between them. "These are records from my family's old business," she explained. "Contracts, ledgers, letters, they all point to the truth." Marcus hesitated, unsure whether to laugh or take her seriously. The documents looked ancient, almost fragile, but there was something undeniably real about them. He flipped through a few pages, noting signatures and dates that matched the early 1900s. It was hard to deny their authenticity, even if their relevance to the modern bank remained unclear. "I'll need time to look into this," Marcus finally said, leaning forward. "If there's anything here worth pursuing, I promise we'll investigate further." Edith studied him intently, searching for sincerity in his eyes. Finally, she gave a slight nod. "Thank you," she said simply. Then, gathering her sack and standing up, she added, "But don't make promises you can't keep. Justice has waited long enough." As Edith left the office, Marcus found himself staring at the stack of papers on his desk. His mind raced with questions. Could her claim actually hold water? Or was this just the rambling of an elderly woman clinging to the past? Either way, he knew he couldn't ignore her completely, not when the weight of her conviction still lingered in the room. Later that evening, as Marcus drove home, he couldn't stop thinking about Edith's story. There was something haunting about it, something that tugged at his conscience. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, calm, resolute, unshaken by doubt. Or maybe it was the stark reminder of injustices long buried under layers of progress. Whatever it was, Marcus realized he couldn't dismiss her so easily, not without looking deeper. Meanwhile, Edith returned to her modest apartment, where she carefully unpacked the contents of her sack onto the kitchen table. Each document told a piece of her family's story, a legacy stolen, erased, and forgotten by most. But Edith refused to let it stay buried. As she traced her fingers over the faded ink, she whispered softly to herself, "They laughed today. Tomorrow, they'll listen." Her determination burned brighter than ever. This wasn't just about reclaiming wealth. It was about restoring dignity. And Edith Bellamy wasn't going to back down until she succeeded. By late afternoon, whispers about Edith Bellamy had spread like wildfire through the bank's corridors. Employees huddled in small groups, exchanging wide-eyed glances and recounting snippets of her bold declaration. Some mocked her outright, mimicking her voice or laughing at the absurdity of a woman with a sack claiming ownership of their prestigious institution. Others, however, couldn't shake off an uneasy feeling. There was something about Edith, her quiet confidence, the way she carried herself, that lingered in their minds long after she left. Among the skeptics was Clara Simmons, a young junior accountant who had overheard the commotion earlier. Clara wasn't particularly ambitious. She preferred working quietly in the background, crunching numbers and avoiding attention. But as she sat at her desk that evening, sipping lukewarm coffee and staring blankly at her computer screen, Edith's words kept replaying in her head. "My grandfather owned shares. They were never transferred properly." Curiosity finally got the better of her. Clara decided to do what no one else seemed willing to: dig deeper. She grabbed a flashlight and headed down to the basement archives, a dimly lit room filled with dusty filing cabinets and forgotten ledgers. The air smelled musty, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the shelves. It was the kind of place people avoided unless absolutely necessary. Clara started pulling out boxes labeled with dates from decades ago. Most contained routine financial reports and transaction records, nothing unusual. But then, tucked away in a corner, she found a box marked Historical Mergers and Acquisitions, 1920s. Her heart raced as she opened it. Inside were faded documents detailing mergers between smaller banks and larger institutions during the early 20th century. One name caught her eye: Bellamy Savings Cooperative. The document described how Bellamy Savings Cooperative, a black-owned financial institution, had been absorbed into First National Reserve under questionable circumstances. According to the paperwork, shares belonging to the Bellamy family had been reassigned without clear consent. Clara's hands trembled as she read further. There were signatures from prominent figures in the bank's history, along with vague language that hinted at coercion rather than cooperation. For hours, Clara pored over the files, piecing together fragments of a story buried beneath layers of time. By the time she emerged from the basement, her mind was racing. What if Edith was telling the truth? What if her family really had been cheated out of their rightful stake? The next morning, Clara hesitated before approaching Marcus Lane. She knew he might dismiss her findings as irrelevant, but she couldn't stay silent. After knocking on his office door, she stepped inside and laid the documents on his desk. "Sir, I think you should see this," she said nervously. "It's about Ms. Bellamy." Marcus raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. As he flipped through the papers, his expression shifted from skepticism to concern. These weren't just random scraps of history. They were potential evidence of wrongdoing. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that Edith's claim might not be as far-fetched as everyone assumed. Word of Clara's discovery began to circulate among the staff. Some dismissed it as coincidence, while others grew increasingly uneasy. Among them was Lisa, the teller who had laughed at Edith the day before. Guilt gnawed at her now. She remembered the look in Edith's eyes, calm, steady, unshaken, and wondered if they had all misjudged her terribly. As days passed, Edith became a quiet symbol of resistance within the walls of the bank. Though most employees still doubted her, a few began to question the foundations of the institution they worked for. Was it built entirely on fairness and integrity, or did its success come at the expense of others? Edith, meanwhile, remained steadfast. Each night, she returned home and carefully reviewed the documents in her sack, preparing for whatever came next. She didn't need validation from anyone, not yet. Deep down, she knew the truth would eventually surface. And when it did, the laughter would fade, replaced by accountability. The following morning, Edith Bellamy returned to the bank, her steps deliberate and confident. This time, she bypassed the teller counters and made a beeline for Marcus Lane's office. The receptionist tried to stop her, but Edith's firm tone left no room for argument. "Tell him I'm here," she said simply. Within moments, she was ushered inside. Marcus greeted her with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. He gestured for her to sit, his eyes flickering toward the burlap sack she carried. "Ms. Bellamy," he began, "we've been looking into your claims. Some interesting details have come up." Edith nodded, unsurprised. "I told you the truth," she replied evenly. "Now it's time for you to face it." Without hesitation, she opened the sack and began placing photocopies of its contents on his desk. Each document was meticulously organized: ledger entries, share certificates, handwritten letters, and even newspaper clippings from the early 1900s. One piece of paper stood out: a faded contract bearing signatures that matched names Clara had uncovered in the archives. Marcus studied the documents closely, his brow furrowing as connections clicked into place. "These look legitimate," he admitted reluctantly. "But proving ownership after all these years won't be easy. Corporate will need more than just old papers." Edith leaned forward, her voice steady but firm. "Then let them see everything. Let them see how my family was pushed aside, how their shares were taken without consent. If they want proof, I'll give it to them, but don't expect me to back down." Her determination left Marcus speechless. For the first time, he saw her not as an eccentric elderly woman, but as someone fighting for justice, a battle decades in the making. He picked up the phone and dialed corporate headquarters, requesting an urgent meeting with the legal team. When Edith arrived at the towering corporate building later that week, she was met with a mixture of skepticism and thinly veiled hostility. Executives shuffled nervously as she laid out her case, presenting each document with precision. At first, they dismissed her claims as baseless, accusing her of dredging up ancient history. But as she pointed out specific irregularities, signatures forged, transactions obscured, the room grew quieter. Even the most skeptical among them couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. One executive, a sharp-eyed lawyer named Patricia Hayes, interrupted the discussion. "Let's assume, for a moment, that some of this is true," she said cautiously. "What exactly are you asking for, Ms. Bellamy?" Edith's gaze never wavered. "I want what's rightfully mine," she said. "Not just for me, but for everyone who was wronged. My family built something valuable, and it was stolen. I'm here to reclaim it." Patricia exchanged uneasy glances with her colleagues. They knew the implications of Edith's claim extended far beyond one woman. It touched the very foundation of their institution. To admit fault would mean opening Pandora's box, inviting scrutiny and potential lawsuits. Yet ignoring her entirely seemed equally risky, especially if word leaked to the public. After hours of tense deliberation, the executives agreed to launch a discreet internal investigation. They instructed their legal team to review Edith's documents alongside historical records, hoping to disprove her claims quietly. But as the days turned into weeks, cracks began to form in their polished facade. Behind closed doors, whispers of panic spread. Some executives argued that Edith's case lacked concrete evidence, while others urged caution. "If even part of this gets out," one warned, "it could destroy our reputation." Meanwhile, Edith remained undeterred. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she wasn't alone anymore. People like Clara Simmons had started questioning the bank's past, and the tide of public opinion was slowly shifting. Every laugh that had once echoed through the lobby now felt hollow, replaced by a growing sense of accountability. As Edith walked home that evening, the weight of the sack in her hand felt lighter somehow. She didn't have victory yet, but she could feel the walls of denial crumbling around her. Justice might take time, but it was closer than ever before. As the internal investigation dragged on, tension within the bank reached a boiling point. Executives whispered nervously in hushed tones during meetings, their polished smiles masking growing unease. The documents Edith Bellamy had presented were proving harder to dismiss than anyone anticipated. Details that once seemed insignificant now loomed large. Forgotten signatures, questionable transactions, and glaring gaps in historical records painted a troubling picture. For the first time, the bank's leadership faced the uncomfortable possibility that its success might have been built, at least in part, on injustice. Outside the boardroom, rumors spread like wildfire. Employees who had laughed at Edith weeks earlier now found themselves questioning their roles in an institution with such a murky past. Some felt guilty for doubting her. Others grew angry, not at Edith, but at the system that had allowed this to happen. Among them was Lisa, the teller who had initially mocked Edith's claim. Now she couldn't stop thinking about the quiet strength in Edith's eyes. What if we've all been complicit? Lisa wondered aloud one afternoon, earning startled looks from her coworkers. Meanwhile, Edith's story began attracting attention beyond the bank's walls. A journalist named Derek Hayes stumbled upon the tale while researching corporate scandals. Intrigued, he dug deeper, uncovering old newspaper articles and interviews with descendants of families who had relied on Bellamy Savings Cooperative. His article, titled "The Woman with the Sack: A Legacy Stolen," went viral almost overnight. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForEdith and #ReturnWhatWasStolen. Protesters gathered outside First National Reserve's headquarters, holding signs and chanting slogans demanding accountability. Inside the bank, executives scrambled to contain the fallout. Public relations teams drafted carefully worded statements denying wrongdoing, but the damage was done. Customers began withdrawing their accounts, and investors called emergency meetings to voice concerns. The pressure mounted when local politicians joined the chorus of voices calling for transparency. Even longtime supporters of the bank started distancing themselves, fearing association with scandal. Amidst the chaos, Edith remained calm. She attended community rallies, speaking passionately about the importance of confronting historical wrongs. Her words resonated deeply, especially among marginalized groups who saw her fight as symbolic of broader struggles for equality and justice. Activists rallied around her, turning her case into a movement. Historians praised her courage, noting how her story highlighted systemic inequities still affecting Black communities today. Behind closed doors, the bank's legal team worked tirelessly to discredit Edith's claims. They argued that too much time had passed, that laws had changed, and that any alleged wrongdoing couldn't be proven conclusively. But each attempt to undermine her only strengthened public support. People admired Edith's resilience, a woman standing alone against a powerful institution, armed with nothing but truth and determination. Executives soon realized they were fighting a losing battle. Ignoring Edith wasn't an option. Doing so would only fuel more outrage. Yet admitting fault carried its own risks. Admitting fault meant opening the door to lawsuits, reparations, and a reckoning no one was prepared for. In a desperate bid to salvage their reputation, the bank proposed a settlement. They offered Edith a substantial sum of money, hoping it would silence her. But Edith refused. Money wasn't her goal. Justice was. She wanted accountability, not just for herself, but for everyone affected by similar injustices. "I'm not here for handouts," she declared firmly. "I'm here to set things right." Her refusal sent shockwaves through the boardroom. Executives, realizing they couldn't buy their way out of this, reluctantly agreed to negotiate terms that went beyond mere compensation. What followed were grueling weeks of discussions, with Edith steadfastly refusing to compromise on key demands. By the end, she secured promises for significant reparations, not just for her family, but for initiatives supporting minority entrepreneurs and financial literacy programs. Though exhausted, Edith walked away knowing she'd sparked something bigger than herself. Justice wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And sometimes, progress was enough. Years passed, and Edith Bellamy's name became synonymous with courage and resilience. Though she had always shied away from the spotlight, her story continued to inspire countless individuals long after the settlement ceremony faded from headlines. Schools across the country included her tale in history lessons, teaching students not just about economic injustice, but also about the power of perseverance. Murals depicting her standing tall with her burlap sack adorned city walls, vibrant reminders of how one person's determination could challenge an entire system. Edith lived out her days quietly, content in the knowledge that she'd made a difference. She spent mornings tending to her garden, where sunflowers grew tall and proud, a fitting reflection of her spirit. In the afternoons, she often hosted young people from the neighborhood, sharing stories of her childhood and offering advice. "Never let anyone tell you your voice doesn't matter," she would say, her eyes twinkling with wisdom. "Even when it feels like no one is listening, keep speaking the truth." Her legacy extended far beyond personal recognition. The reparations fund established through the settlement flourished, supporting hundreds of minority entrepreneurs who otherwise might never have had a chance. Small businesses sprang up in communities once neglected by traditional banks. Barbershops, bakeries, tech startups, all built on opportunities created because of Edith's fight. Scholarships funded by the initiative sent bright young minds to universities, many of whom returned to their neighborhoods to give back. First National Reserve, too, underwent a transformation. Once seen as a symbol of greed and exploitation, it worked tirelessly to rebuild trust. The bank partnered with local organizations to offer free financial literacy workshops, ensuring that underserved communities had access to tools they needed to thrive. Executives even began hosting annual forums dedicated to addressing racial inequality in banking, inviting activists, scholars, and community leaders to guide their efforts. Despite these changes, Edith remained humble. When reporters occasionally knocked on her door seeking interviews, she politely declined, saying simply, "The work isn't about me. It's about what comes next." Her focus was always forward-looking, urging others to carry the torch of justice into the future. One crisp autumn morning, news spread that Edith had passed away peacefully in her sleep. Tributes poured in from around the world. Politicians praised her bravery, activists honored her legacy, and ordinary citizens shared memories of how her story had touched their lives. A public memorial service drew thousands, filling the streets near her home with flowers, candles, and heartfelt notes. At its center stood a large portrait of Edith, smiling gently, her burlap sack resting at her side. In the years that followed, Edith's impact only deepened. Historians revisited her case, uncovering more stories of families whose contributions had been erased by predatory practices. Activists used her example to push for broader reforms, demanding accountability from industries beyond banking. Even corporate leaders, inspired by her unyielding moral compass, began prioritizing ethical practices over profit margins. For those who had known her personally, Edith's memory lingered in quieter ways. Clara Simmons often visited Edith's old apartment building, now converted into affordable housing units named in her honor. Lisa, the teller who had laughed during Edith's first visit, became a vocal advocate for workplace diversity, crediting Edith with changing her perspective forever. And then there was the burlap sack itself, an artifact preserved in a museum dedicated to civil rights history. Visitors marveled at its simplicity, imagining all it had carried: documents, dreams, and decades of struggle. For many, it served as a reminder that truth, though heavy, could move mountains if wielded with conviction. As time went on, Edith's story evolved into something larger than life, a beacon of hope for anyone fighting against injustice. People remembered her not just as the woman with the sack, but as a symbol of strength, dignity, and unwavering faith in the possibility of change. Justice takes time, Edith had once said, but when you plant seeds of truth, they grow roots deeper than fear, and sooner or later, they'll bloom. And bloom they did, in classrooms, boardrooms, and communities everywhere. Edith Bellamy may have left this world, but her legacy lived on, proving that even the smallest voices could echo through generations when rooted in courage and conviction. The media storm surrounding Edith Bellamy reached a fever pitch, and her story became impossible to ignore. Derek Hayes' article had struck a chord with the public, igniting conversations about systemic racism, economic inequality, and corporate accountability. News outlets picked up the story, turning Edith into an overnight sensation. Her face appeared on television screens and magazine covers, often accompanied by headlines like "The Woman Who Challenged a Giant" or "Justice in a Burlap Sack." For many, Edith represented more than just one woman's fight for justice. She symbolized generations of marginalized people whose contributions had been erased, stolen, or overlooked. Community leaders rallied behind her cause, organizing marches and town hall meetings to discuss the broader implications of her case. Schools incorporated her story into lessons about civil rights and activism, while historians revisited archives to uncover other forgotten tales of exploitation. Inside First National Reserve, panic reigned supreme. Executives huddled in emergency meetings, their faces pale as they grappled with the growing backlash. Customers continued to withdraw funds en masse, and investors threatened to pull out entirely unless drastic action was taken. The bank's once pristine image was cracking under the weight of scrutiny, and every attempt to downplay Edith's claims only made things worse. Desperate to regain control, the bank launched a full-scale audit of its historical records, a task that hadn't been undertaken in decades. Teams of lawyers, accountants, and historians sifted through dusty ledgers, searching for answers. What they found shocked even the most hardened skeptics. Irregularities piled up, missing documents, suspicious transfers, and evidence of coercion during mergers. It became clear that Edith's allegations weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern stretching back nearly a century. As damning details emerged, the pressure mounted. Politicians called for congressional hearings, vowing to investigate similar cases across the banking industry. Activist groups demanded reparations not only for Edith, but for all families impacted by predatory practices. Protesters gathered daily outside the bank's headquarters, chanting slogans and holding signs bearing Edith's name. The message was clear. Silence was no longer an option. Faced with mounting evidence and public outrage, the bank's executives finally conceded. They issued a formal apology, acknowledging past injustices and pledging to make amends. But Edith wasn't satisfied with empty words. She insisted on concrete actions. Actions that would ensure real change, not just lip service. Negotiations dragged on for weeks, with Edith refusing to back down. Every term she proposed came from a place of principle. Scholarships for minority students, grants for Black-owned businesses, and programs aimed at closing the racial wealth gap. When executives balked at the cost, she reminded them bluntly, "You've profited off my family's loss for nearly 100 years. This isn't charity, it's restitution." Her unwavering stance earned widespread admiration. People marveled at how this unassuming elderly woman had stood toe-to-toe with one of the most powerful institutions in the country, and won. Even those who had doubted her early on now saw her as a hero. Lisa, the teller who had laughed when Edith first arrived, tearfully apologized after hearing her speak at a community event. "I underestimated you," Lisa admitted, "but I see now what true strength looks like." Finally, after months of tense negotiations, a settlement was reached. The bank agreed to recognize Edith's family as rightful stakeholders and provide substantial reparations. More importantly, they committed to implementing long-term initiatives aimed at addressing systemic inequities. While some critics argued the measures didn't go far enough, most agreed it was a step in the right direction. On the day the agreement was announced, Edith stood before a crowd of supporters outside the bank's headquarters. Clutching her burlap sack, one last time, she addressed the cheering masses. "This isn't just my victory," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "It belongs to everyone who has ever been told their voice doesn't matter. Justice may be slow, but it always finds its way." As cameras flashed and applause erupted, Edith allowed herself a small smile. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she knew the tide was turning. For the first time in decades, the truth was finally seeing the light of day, and it couldn't be ignored any longer. The day of the official settlement ceremony arrived, and it felt like the entire city had turned out to witness history. First National Reserve's headquarters was transformed into a stage for accountability and reconciliation. Cameras lined the entrance, reporters jostled for position, and crowds gathered outside, holding banners that read "Truth Prevails" and "Justice for All." Inside, the grand hall buzzed with anticipation. Executives in tailored suits mingled uneasily with activists clad in protest T-shirts, their shared space a testament to how far things had come. Edith Bellamy entered the room quietly, dressed in her signature floral dress, but now wearing a sash gifted to her by supporters. It bore the words "Champion of Justice" embroidered in bold gold letters. Her burlap sack hung loosely from her hand, its contents no longer needed. It had served its purpose. As she walked to the front of the room, escorted by cheering onlookers, even the most skeptical executives couldn't help but feel a pang of respect. This unassuming woman had single-handedly forced one of the nation's largest banks to confront its past. The ceremony began with speeches from both sides. A senior executive named Patricia Hayes spoke first, reading a prepared statement. "Today marks a new chapter for First National Reserve," she said, her voice steady but tinged with regret. "We acknowledge the mistakes of our predecessors and commit ourselves to building a more equitable future." The audience listened silently, some nodding in approval while others crossed their arms, waiting to hear what Edith would say. When it was her turn, Edith stepped up to the podium without hesitation. She scanned the crowd briefly before speaking, her voice soft yet powerful. "I didn't do this for fame or money," she began. "I did it because my grandfather taught me that truth matters. He believed in fairness, in giving people a chance to build something better for themselves, and when they took that away from him, They tried to erase his legacy. She paused, letting her words sink in. But legacies don't die unless we let them. Today isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever been pushed aside, told their dreams don't matter, or made to feel small. This is proof that standing up for what's right can change the world. Her speech drew a standing ovation, tears streaming down many faces. Among them was Clara Simmons, the junior accountant whose discovery had helped ignite the investigation. She approached Edith afterward, clutching a notebook filled with ideas for financial literacy programs inspired by the settlement. "Thank you," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "You've shown us all what courage looks like." As part of the agreement, Edith accepted a ceremonial key to the bank vault, not as a gesture of ownership, but as a symbol of transparency and accountability. When she held it aloft during the ceremony, cheers erupted once again. For many, it represented far more than metal. It stood for justice long delayed but finally delivered. In the weeks that followed, Edith became a national icon. Schools invited her to speak at assemblies, where children eagerly asked questions about her journey. Artists painted murals of her defiant stance, turning blank walls into vibrant tributes. Even late-night talk show hosts joked about the woman with the sack, though their tone carried admiration rather than mockery. Despite the newfound attention, Edith remained humble. She continued living in her modest apartment, tending to her garden and cooking meals for neighbors. But her life wasn't the only one transformed. Thanks to the reparations fund established through the settlement, dozens of minority entrepreneurs received grants to start businesses. Scholarships were awarded to students pursuing careers in finance, ensuring that opportunities once denied to Edith's family would be available to future generations. For First National Reserve, the road to redemption was just beginning. The bank launched initiatives aimed at addressing systemic inequities, including partnerships with Black-owned institutions and community outreach programs. While critics argued these efforts were too little, too late, others acknowledged they marked a step toward meaningful change. As Edith sat on her porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she reflected on everything that had transpired. The laughter, the doubt, the resistance, all of it seemed distant now, overshadowed by the progress achieved. She smiled softly, knowing her fight had sparked something bigger than herself. Justice might have taken decades to arrive, but when it did, it brought hope along with it. And hope, Edith believed, was worth fighting for.